Hello, the chess world. Today we will talk about chess openings because chess openings aren't easy and we have to understand them in order to play them correctly. Even at the highest level, many chess players are struggling with, many opening lines and or with fundamentals ideas. So the first thing that I want to talk with you is, of course, the king's pawn opening, which is the pawn e4, the pawn from the king. The reason why we can also call it the open game is because we are opening up diagonal of the bishop and from the queen. We will talk about d4, c4, knight f3 a little bit later on, and then of course some other uncommon openings. But I want to explain you the sense, or at least the idea of pawn move e4. So there are many responses possible. The Sicilian defense, knight c5. Pawn c5. We have the response e5, the response e6. We have the response g6 or knight f6. These are very difficult lines, which aren't actually the main line. And before actually explaining you these moves, I will have to explain some main lines before actually explaining you these ideas. So what is the purpose of e4? E4, the purpose of this move is just that we are controlling d5 perfectly and we are just opening up lines for our pieces. It doesn't mean that we want to go bishop c4 and queen f3 with checkmate in 4 moves, but we can. Boom, pawn e5. That is actually the main line, and this is the so-called king's pawn game because both uh, of whites and blacks pawns from the king are actually in the center. Now, knight f3 is the best move. Of course, knight f6 exists, knight c3 exists, it is the Vienna game, d4 exists, it is the central game, f4 exists, this is the king's gambit, but the king's gambit will come a little bit later on. Knight f3 is the main move, and the reason why we call a move a main move is because after long thought process, a big amount of theory, of analysis, of work on that, we can just determine that, yeah, it is the best approach. There is nothing better than knight f3 for the moment. Of course, the engine will say, na, everything is equal, but in practice, theoreticians aren't people who are messing up with chess. They are playing chess. They are they aren't only fans of the game, they are understanding the game. So knight f3 is the best move. Knight c6 is also the best move. And now the best response, again, could be d4, by the way, c3 or bishop c4. This is the Italian game, but bishop b5. And the idea of bishop b5 is that we are actually putting the center under pressure. There is a very nice game played by one of the first world chess champion, Emmanuel Lasker, I think against Frank Marshall, I'm sorry, who played, I think, d6 and he took on c6 and Lasker won a very nice endgame because the pawn structure is just destroyed. You can see that the pawns are doubled and after d3 the center is very solid. But okay, let's go back into our analysis. Bishop b5. The idea is just to actually protect the pawn in the center with the pawn move d3 or queen e2. Knight c3 is also possible in order to protect the pawn, and the idea is just to castle fast. And that is also the reason why we play in the open game. It is in order to castle very fast. The difference with e4 and d4 is that if you go d4, you will need some more time to actually castle with your king. So that is the main difference. But let's say e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. It is actually the Ruy Lopez. If we go bishop c4, it is the Italian game, and the idea is actually the same. We want to castle. Okay, let's say we can take the center with c3, d4, but let's say castles, knight f6, d3, castles, knight c3. It is an old main line, and this is, for example, a very nice position to play because we are having very nice open lines, and the game is just equal, but we have a small edge thanks to the rook. Black has the bishop pair because black just took our pawn, and we can be afraid of that. So if you want, instead of actually playing knight c3, you can go a3 first in order to remove the bishop and actually threaten a fork on b4. For example, this b4 attacking two pieces at the same time, and we are just winning a piece and the game. So it is, for example, an idea in the Italian game. Of course, in the Ruy Lopez, I can show you a nice variation. Let's say knight f6 is the Berlin defense, d3, bishop c5, castles. Let's say knight c3, knight d4, bishop there. And the position is actually very difficult. Now we are having a very nice position again with the white pieces. It is like an Italian game in which black went knight d4. But, we can't be sure that this is good or not. Black wants to go bishop g4, pinning us, so we go h3, and now the game starts for many players. It is just a line. Of course, you can study all these lines on your side, but I'm already giving you, the perfect vision of each opening. Openings are schizophrenic, like a very strong chess grandmaster said, Roman Gintchihashvili. He said that openings are schizophrenic because usually we want to play a line in order to have a solid and boring game, very positional, and somehow everything is tactical. And on the reverse, sometimes players are playing the Sicilian defense against e4, and then somehow there is no tactics, everything is super duper positional. To explain you the openings even more, now we just saw a symmetric game, e4, e5, which is giving a lot of, chances for both players. But actually, there are some semi-open or semi-closed games. e4, e5 is a wide open game. But actually, let's say black goes c5. Now we are the one with an open position, and black doesn't have an open position. So we can call it a semi-open position. The Sicilian defense is very known in order to actually it's a very used weapon, and it's very known in general because it is a very nice weapon, especially used by a world chess champion, Mikhail Tal, who was a very nice tactician. He was sacrificing stuff all the time. Uh, for example, a concrete line could look like that. This. For example, knight f6, knight c3. Yeah, for example, knight c6, knight db5, or knight c6, e5, knight d5, knight e4. And this is already a very positional line in which both players have a lot of chances. The king will be a little bit in the center. In return, white will actually have a very nice position, but the outpost on d5 is pretty strong. The pawn on e5 is still a little bit weak, like f4, now queen b6, trying to attack the king, developing the bishop normally, bishop a6. And even though white has a little bit more space, it looks like white isn't going to actually attack this king, because let's say we trade queens off the board. Now checkmate is a very difficult threat. Yeah, and now f5, and if we take en passant, everything is pretty equal. But you see that openings are always equal. It is impossible to actually win immediately in the openings. It is just important to keep in mind that if you are precise enough, you will be able to have chances of actually doing something. It is the way we win in chess at a top level, or at least at a very good level. We have to invite our opponents to actually commit mistakes. Now that we saw a little bit of the Sicilian defense, now I think we can understand the difference between e4 and e5. Now, let's say a player plays a move like g6. We can just take the center, and this is the whole idea. If we have two times, let's say we can play two moves in a row with the white pieces, we really want to go e4 then d4 in order to have the center, because having the center, at least at a certain level, until a certain level, means already having a nice advantage. But okay, g6, d4, for example, bishop g7, knight c3. It is the modern defense, the standard line, or the very basic lines, knight f3 or h3 first, knight f6, knight f3. Now the bishop cannot go on g4. And for example, castles, bishop e2, c5, d5, and the game isn't that easy, but at the same time it is. So you have to know this line pretty correctly for the black pieces, because white is having a very nice center, and it's very difficult to actually, break through if we do not know this opening. So now that you understand that you want a center, what happens after knight f6? After knight f6, you can just push pawn e5. Knight d5, if the knight goes back, you can just go d4, knight c3, and you're having a very nice position. And if knight d5, there is actually a very interesting line which I will invite you to analyze. It is c4, d4, we are having a very strong center, d6 and f4. And the reason why this variation is so complicated is because we are just moving pawns forward for no reason. Actually, not for no reason. We will actually, go knight c3, bishop e3, and then only knight f3. For example, let's say, let me think. Let's say we take, and knight c6. Now this is attacked. If we go knight f3, bishop g4, there is a problem. So we start with bishop e3. And now if you go bishop f5, I go knight c3 first, and once e6 is played, now I can go knight f3, because if you go bishop g4 again, now it's not the same stuff anymore. Everything is already perfectly protected. I can just go bishop e2, and the main line continues with takes f3, pawn takes, not bishop takes because c4 might be hanging. So takes c3, queen h4, bishop f2, queen f4, c5, knight d7, and I think queen d2. And now we're having a very, very complicated position in which we actually have an endgame, but in return of this endgame, we actually have the bishop pair and more space in the center. What does black have? A very nice outpost on d5. So black will have to prove that this outpost on d5 is eventually better than this two bishop pair, than actually these two bishops. And the bishop is blocked behind his own pawn. So that's a very, very tricky position. A lot of players might win or not win that. That's not a clear position at all. Now that we saw the Sicilian defense, you have a very nice understanding of these semi-open lines. What happens, for example, after e6? Again, we take the center. We can take now this is actually the French defense. We can take a lot of space, or we can trade in the center, or we can protect the pawn. It is how you feel. If you go e5, you're going for a win. Then you have to learn some lines by heart in which black is trying to attack your pawn chain from this line, from this side of the board. Queen b6, bishop d3, bishop there, castles. You're sacrificing a pawn, but in return, you're just having a very, very, very nice position. Which is actually very, very funny because you just sacrifice a pawn, actually two pawns, but the king is weak. Queen d6, knight b5, everything is weak. So yeah, you can actually analyze this line. It is a very, very solid line for the white pieces. White has actually a lot more chances of winning because white is having a very nice lead in development. The king didn't castle yet, so white is actually doing well. Another line that I can propose you is actually to not sacrifice the pawn, but it is actually to go, let me think, a3, knight e7, and actually b4. And the idea is that if we take on d4 now, we would just go, for example, knight f5, bishop b2, protecting the pawn in the center. And the position is pretty equalized, but white is still having a nice edge thanks to the pawn chain. Black will actually go a5 in order to attack the pawn structure, but it's not a problem. We can just move forward. The pawn is protected by the bishop. Let's say black doesn't move but go bishop d7. It is super duper losing because actually we can just go a4, and now we are having a very solid position. I thought in a second that we could take, but sadly enough, a1 is hanging, so that is a small problem. So we have to go a4 first. The knight can move away or doesn't have to move away. Let's say he goes rook ac8. We can, just develop normally or go knight d2. The engine is recommending, and actually some modern games are recommending g4, which is of course interesting in order to attack on the king's side and, for example, reaching something like that. Everything is playable. It just depends on what is your playing style based on. Okay, I won't speak about the Philidor defense because it isn't the purpose of this lesson, and we already talked about a lot of openings which are discussing what happens when you do not have the center. Now I will talk about d4 a little bit. d4 is actually very, 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 very interesting. Why? Because we aren't able to castle immediately. We aren't able because we are not moving the pieces on the king's side fast enough. But what do we have in return? Chess, everything is a question of having something and having something in return. What we have in return is actually that we have more pawns in the center. I will show you three lines, which are the Queen's Gambit, the King's Indian Defense, and the Nimzo-Indian Defense. Let's say black goes d5. We can just go c4. Two moves are possible, e6, d takes e4. If d takes e4, we can just go knight c3, for example, then e4, and we would just get this pawn back. e6, knight, bishop there, and if we look carefully, it is like playing e4, black didn't play e5, and we played d4, so white is just having a very nice position. You can study these older lines in order to understand d4. Let's say now he goes e6. Okay, you can just go knight c3, knight f6, knight f3. Let's say knight d7 or bishop e7. You can just go bishop g5, castles, e3 in order to protect the pawn. By the way, let's say black takes right now. You can again just go e3 or e4. Let's say e3. And if they go b5, the knight is already on c3, guarding the pawn, which is good for you. By the way, let's say they take, you go knight c3, they go c6, e4, b5. Actually, now you have a very nice move, which is a4. You're attacking this pawn chain, and if they take here, you will just take on c4, a4 is hanging, so actually you're just having a very nice position. Let's say they go b4 instead. You can just go knight d2, attacking the pawn. If they go b3, you can just go knight c3. The pawn is hanging, so they have to protect it with bishop a6. But no, knight f3. The threat is actually, you will see it, e6 and knight e5. And this pawn is unprotectable. So no matter what happens, if black takes, the pawn is usually untakeable. If you're blundering or something like that in the middle game, certainly a problem might happen. But otherwise, no. So I can show you a small line from the Queen's Gambit: knight f6, bishop g5, knight d7, knight f3, bishop e7, e3, castles, bishop d3. You see that this bishop is now coming out, and this is the time where black should take, and for example go a6. So we have a nice center because we have more pawns in the center. We have a pawn on d4 and black has a pawn on e6. So white is having a small edge, but in return, black will actually go b5, bishop b7, and having a nice attack on this long diagonal. And then game continues. There are many games in the database. I can just invite you to actually analyze this opening. It is a very important opening if you want to improve at chess. But now let's talk about another line. We talked about d4, d6. If black goes e6 or knight c6, it is an invitation to actually take the center. I would recommend you to take it. Let's say that now, instead of playing d5, they go knight f6. There are actually many lines. I will show you the Sicilian defense now. It is when you go c4 with the white pieces, g6, knight c3. Now there is actually a nice crossroad. We can go bishop g7, the Sicilian defense, or d5, the Grunfeld. The idea of this opening is actually just to give away the center, but in return we are having, a lot of counterattack on the pawns in the center. If you move forward, then actually you're just losing a pawn. It is certainly playable, but it is very difficult. So let's go back. It is the Grunfeld defense. Let's talk about the Sicilian defense. So the Sicilian defense is now bishop g7, e4. You can go d6. You can castle. Bobby Fischer, a very strong world champion, played castles. His opponent went e5, knight e8. I think f4 or something like that. And then c5, d6 happened, knight f3, c5, and he got just demolished with the white pieces. It is a very complicated line. And the center will just collapse. That's the main reason why this line is important. But I can just recommend you to go d6 first, castles. Okay, let's say knight f3, castles, bishop e2, e5, d5, a5, castles, knight s6 in order to go on c5, a3, knight c5, bishop e3, for example. The pawn is hanging, so you have to go queen c2. And now it is a very complicated line. Black will try to actually move the knight away and go f5 in order to attack the king on the king's side. And in return, we will have to attack on the queen side. If we lose time trying to defend, actually we will have no chance to defend on this side of the board. The best way to protect yourself in chess is just to wait until your opponent comes to you. So f5, and in return we will try to go b4, trying to open up lines on the queen side. Now we will focus on piece development and control of the center with the Nimzo-Indian defense. The Nimzo-Indian defense is when you go e6 instead of g6, knight c3, and bishop b4. The idea of bishop b4 is that we want to actually control the center. We want to control the dark squares, but we want to actually destroy one white piece, which is actually doing a great job on the light squares. Let's say knight f3, castles. Okay, let's say bishop g5. We can just go, d5, for example, and now we are just having a nice position with the black pieces. For example, it is a line which can happen a lot. The position is pretty good equalized. We will go c6. The position is still sharp because chess is a sharp game, but we have a lot of good points with the black pieces. We're just having a very easy development, and the white pieces will try to actually focus on the e5 square. So that's the main reason why we should go, for example, bishop g4, trying to pin that knight. If h3, we can just take it or go bishop h5. g4 is a super duper aggressive line, which is probably playable. I can just recommend you to analyze this as much as you can, because learning stuff is never bad, especially when you're working consistently. Okay, so it was a nice overview on the d4 queen's pawn opening. Now we will focus on something more interesting than that. We will actually focus on the flank opening other than c4. This chapter will be very short because it is a so-called hypermodern chess school, we are just not putting any pawns in the center. We just want to control the center squares with the knights and the bishops. For example, let's say d5, c4. D takes c4, knight c3, and now we are controlling everything with the knights. Of course, d4 is playable, then b4, again, we are doing a great job controlling everything on the queen side with the pawns, and the center is controlled by the knight. So this is something that can happen. We would usually go g3, bishop g2. You can see that as the Reti opening, or the Catalan, or the King's Fianchetto opening, for example, g3 first move. Let's say this, bishop g2, knight d6, d4, knight d7, knight f3, e6, castles, oopsie, this. And this is a very, very solid line, c4, oopsie, c4, castles, knight c3. And this is, for example, a setup which we usually really like to have with the white pieces. It is a very solid line, and I played this my whole life, so I can just recommend you to play it as many times as you can. Now, in order to discuss a little bit on uncommon openings, the reason why they are uncommon is because they aren't good. Let's say you go g4, it is the Grob opening. The Grob isn't good at all. And when I say it's not good, the engine says white is losing because, let's say we play actually the main line, this g4, c6, c takes d5. It is a line in which we are trying to opening up everything, and we want to attack with the queen and with the bishop. I mean, with the bishop and with the queen. So in theory, it is sensible, and white is actually having a very nice, very nice results in this opening. But it isn't the best opening choice that you could ever try. Probably, in order to surprise your opponents, you can go for the Grob, but I won't recommend you. e6, by the way, is losing the game because of queen a4 check, winning a piece immediately. So let's go back. Queen b3, knight f6 is forced. And now we can just take on b7, knight bd7, and the engine says black is better, but we have to protect ourselves. Actually, black has nothing to do. The queen is just trapped, and we're just having a nice development. The white king has nowhere to castle. That's the main reason why the engine says that white is having a bad position. The king has nowhere to castle. Knight f3 castles, there is no more pawn on the g file. And if we castle over here, there is no more pawn on the c file. So this is very complicated. So it is probably the most uncommon opening ever. There is also something called the Sicilian Defense, which starts with knight f3. Let's say we have a position like that. This is something like that. This castles only now it's important to focus on white position. This is position that we want to achieve with the white pieces, and we will usually go h3, g4, e5, rook e1, knight f1, knight g3, and trying to attack on the king side. So it is 100% bluff. But it is a very strong opening. Many grandmasters are basically playing that their whole life without even thinking twice about that. So I can just recommend you to actually analyze this line. It is very interesting. White has a very huge score of winning and losing and so on. Actually, white has 86% win on the board, which is of course very good. Yeah, I think we already talked about all of that. Understanding these openings involves not just memorizing moves, but grasping ideas. I mean, grasping some hidden ideas, underlying ideas. Each opening leads to different types of positions, and players often choose openings that align with their playing style. So if you are very positional, I can just recommend you c4 or d4. Just remember that openings is the best way for you to actually complement your overall understanding of strategy and tactics. You cannot just memorize moves. You have to really understand the ideas behind each move, and you have to adapt yourself on the position that are on the board. Let's say that you're reaching a position after the opening and you say, oh, but this isn't the type of position that I usually want. That's not a problem. Now you're just playing chess. Now it's time for you to be smart. Thank you very much for listening to me. Hopefully you enjoyed this small lesson, and see you in the future. Take care.